The morning sun filtered through the blinds as Sophie Bennett sat at the kitchen table, her small fingers wrapped around a colored pencil. She was drawing a picture of their family, just her and Dad. At 8 years old, Sophie's artwork showed promise beyond her years, especially in how she captured expressions. Her father always said she had a gift for seeing the heart behind the face. Mark Bennett watched his daughter from the doorway, coffee mug in hand, his tired eyes softening at the sight of her. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with photos and Sophie's artwork. It wasn't much, but they made it home after Sophie's mom left 3 years ago. "Almost done, Soph?" Mark asked, glancing at the clock. "Dr. Rivera wants to see us by 9. Sophie nodded without looking up, adding yellow streaks to her father's hair in the drawing. "Just making you extra sunshiny," she said with a gap-toothed smile. Mark forced a smile in return, but worry gnawed at his stomach. The bruises that appeared on Sophie's legs for no reason. The tiredness that wouldn't go away despite early bedtimes. The nosebleeds that took longer and longer to stop. Something wasn't right, and after weeks of putting it off, blaming his construction work injuries for draining their savings, he'd finally made the doctor appointment. On the bus ride to the hospital, Sophie rested her head against the window, her normally bouncy energy subdued. Mark noticed how pale she looked against her favorite purple sweater, how the morning light made her seem almost transparent. He reached over and tucked a strand of light brown hair behind her ear. "Remember when we went to the beach last summer?" he asked, trying to distract both of them from the worry hanging in the air. Sophie perked up slightly. "When I buried you in the sand and gave you a mermaid tail? And I couldn't get up when that cute lifeguard walked by," Mark chuckled. "I still haven't forgiven you for that." Sophie giggled, but it quickly turned into a cough that seemed to rattle her whole body. Mark rubbed her back gently until it passed, pretending not to notice the flash of pain that crossed her face. The waiting room of the children's clinic was painted in bright colors, with cartoon characters dancing across the walls. Sophie immediately wandered to the small table with books and toys while Mark checked them in. He could feel the weight of his worn work boots on the clean floor, the roughness of his calloused hands as he filled out paperwork. This place wasn't meant for people like him. Construction workers living paycheck to paycheck with insurance that barely covered the basics. When a nurse called Sophie's name, Mark felt his heart skip. He'd grown used to handling life's problems on his own since his wife left. But this, the fear in his gut when he looked at his too pale daughter, this was different. Dr. Rivera was younger than Mark expected, with kind eyes and a soft voice that immediately put Sophie at ease. She talked directly to Sophie first, asking about school and her favorite subjects, examining the bruises on her legs with gentle fingers. "I'm clumsy," Sophie explained seriously. "Dad says I got that from Mom." Mark winced at the mention of Sophie's mother, who hadn't called in months. The examination continued with blood pressure checks and questions about Sophie's energy levels and appetite. Dr. Rivera's face remained professional, but Mark caught the slight furrow of her brow when Sophie mentioned how tired she'd been feeling lately. "We'll need to run some tests," Dr. Rivera said finally, turning to Mark. "Blood work mostly to start with." Sophie's eyes widened with fear at the mention of needles, but she set her jaw in that stubborn way that reminded Mark so much of himself. "Will it hurt?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Dr. Rivera didn't sugarcoat it. "A little bit, but just for a moment." "And you seem like a very brave young lady." Sophie nodded solemnly. "I am. Dad says I'm the toughest kid in the whole apartment building." The blood draw wasn't easy. Sophie tried her best not to cry, her small hand crushing Mark's fingers as the nurse filled several vials. Mark kept his voice steady, telling her stories about the construction site where he worked, about the tallest building in the city that he helped build before his back injury. "Results should be back in a couple of days," Dr. Rivera said as they prepared to leave. Her hand rested briefly on Mark's shoulder. "Try not to worry too much until we know what we're dealing with." But worry he did. Through his physical therapy session for his injured back, through his argument with the insurance company about coverage for his treatments, through dinner that night when Sophie pushed her favorite spaghetti around her plate without eating much. The call came faster than expected. Just the next afternoon while Sophie was at school, Dr. Rivera's voice was calm but serious. "Mr. Bennett, we'd like you to bring Sophie in as soon as possible to discuss her test results." Mark's throat tightened. "How soon is as soon as possible?" There was a pause. Today would be best. I've already spoken with the school nurse. She's with Sophie now. The world seemed to tilt under Mark's feet. He gripped the kitchen counter to steady himself. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The hospital seemed colder this time, the bright colors of the children's ward unable to lift the heaviness in Mark's chest. Sophie sat in a chair that was too big for her, swinging her legs and looking at a picture book the school nurse had given her. She looked up when Mark entered, her face brightening. Dad, Miss Thompson let me leave math early. Mark forced a smile, kneeling to hug her tightly. Lucky you. I was terrible at math when I was your age. Dr. Rivera met them in her office rather than an exam room. There were diplomas on the wall and family photos on her desk, a glimpse into a normal life that Mark suddenly feared might be slipping away from them. Sophie's blood work showed some concerning irregularities. Dr. Rivera began after they were seated. She spoke directly to both of them, not just to Mark. Her white blood cell count is much higher than normal, and there are some unusual cells present. Mark felt his heart pounding in his ears. What does that mean exactly? Dr. Rivera's eyes were gentle but direct. It suggests leukemia, a type of blood cancer. We need to do more tests to confirm the diagnosis and determine the specific type. The word cancer hit Mark like a physical blow. He reached for Sophie's hand instinctively, finding it small and warm in his rough palm. Am I sick? Sophie asked, her voice impossibly small. Dr. Rivera nodded. Yes, but there are very good treatments for this type of sickness. Many kids get better and go on to live normal, healthy lives. Sophie seemed to consider this information carefully. Will I lose my hair like Mrs. Ortiz from apartment 3B when she was sick? The question, so practical and yet so heartbreaking, brought tears to Mark's eyes that he quickly blinked away. You might, Dr. Rivera answered honestly, but hair grows back, and you'd look just as beautiful without it. While Sophie looked through a picture book showing what would happen during her treatment, Mark stepped outside with Dr. Rivera to discuss next steps. The hallway lights seemed too bright, making his head pound. We'll need to admit her today for more tests. If it is what I suspect, treatment should begin as soon as possible, Dr. Rivera explained. Mark nodded numbly, his mind racing to practical matters. Work, insurance, bills. His recent back injury had already strained their finances to the breaking point. How much will this cost? He asked, his voice hoarse. Dr. Rivera's expression softened with understanding. I'll have our financial counselor meet with you today. There are programs that can help. Later that evening, after Sophie had been admitted and fallen asleep in her hospital bed surrounded by unfamiliar machines, Mark stepped into the hallway to make phone calls. To his boss, explaining why he wouldn't be at physical therapy tomorrow. To their neighbor, asking her to water Sophie's plants. To the insurance company, where he was put on hold for 45 minutes only to be told that many of the treatments Sophie would need weren't fully covered. The financial counselor had been kind, but realistic. Even with assistance programs, the costs would be staggering. Mark leaned against the cold hospital wall, closing his eyes as the magnitude of what lay ahead washed over him. When he returned to Sophie's room, she was awake, her small face serious in the dim light. Dad? She whispered. Are you scared? Mark considered lying, then thought better of it. Sophie had always been able to see right through him. Yeah, Soph, I am. She nodded, making room for him to sit on the edge of her bed. Me too. But remember what you always tell me about the monsters under the bed? Despite everything, Mark found himself smiling. What's that? The brave part isn't not being scared. It's what you do even though you're scared. Mark felt his chest tighten with a love so fierce it hurt. He smoothed her hair back from her forehead. When did you get so wise, kiddo? Sophie shrugged, her eyelids growing heavy again. Probably from all those superhero movies you let me watch. As she drifted back to sleep, Mark remained beside her, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Outside the window, the city lights blurred through his tears. He had no idea how they would manage this, how they would afford the treatments or handle what lay ahead. But looking at his daughter's face, peaceful now in sleep, he made a silent promise. They would find a way, whatever it took. Sophie would get better, and he would move mountains to make it happen. For now, though all he could do was hold her hand and be brave, even though he was terrified. 2 weeks into Sophie's treatment, the apartment felt different, quieter. The kitchen counter was lined with orange prescription bottles, each with complicated names that Mark practiced pronouncing. A calendar on the fridge was marked with colored dots: blue for hospital visits, red for blood tests, green for the good days when Sophie felt strong enough to go outside. Today was a green dot day. Sophie sat at the kitchen table eating dry cereal one piece at a time. The chemo had changed her appetite, made some foods taste like metal. But cereal was safe, familiar. "Can we watch the cooking show tonight?" she asked, her voice brighter than it had been in days. Mark looked up from the pile of medical bills he'd been sorting through. "You bet. It's the dessert challenge. Your favorite." Sophie nodded, pleased. Then she noticed her father's frown as he tapped numbers into the calculator. "Is something wrong?" "With the numbers, Dad?" Mark quickly rearranged his expression. "Just grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." But Sophie was observant, always had been. Later that evening, while Mark thought she was asleep, she heard him on the phone in the kitchen, voice hushed but tense. "I understand the policy limitations, but there has to be some flexibility here. Yes, I know the deductible. No, I can't just come up with $5,000. Sophie pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. $5,000. That number hung in the air, enormous and scary. She knew about money problems. Before her mom left, there had been lots of late-night arguments about bills. At school the next day, another green dot day, Sophie couldn't concentrate on her math worksheet. Ms. Chen had been extra nice since Sophie started treatment, letting her rest when she needed to, and not calling on her unless Sophie raised her hand. During the afternoon reading time, Sophie picked a book about kids starting businesses. There was a whole chapter about lemonade stands. The book said a girl in Texas had made over $100 in one weekend selling lemonade. $100 wasn't $5,000. But it was something. That night over dinner, plain pasta for Sophie, sauce only on Mark's portion, she pushed her fork around her plate, gathering courage. "Dad, I want to help with the money." Mark looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" "Soph, I heard you talking about needing $5,000 for my medicine." Mark's face fell. He set down his fork and reached for Sophie's hand. "Honey, that's not something you need to worry about. It's my job to figure that stuff out." Sophie sat up straighter. "I know. But we're a team, right? That's what you always say. We are a team." "Then I want to help. I want to sell lemonade." Mark stared at her, confused. "Lemonade? We read about it in school. Kids make money with lemonade stands. I can do it on green dot days." Mark started to shake his head, a refusal forming. But Sophie spoke again, her voice small but determined. "Please, Dad. I hate that you're worried all the time. I want to help." Something in Mark's chest tightened at her words. His 8-year-old daughter, sick and tired from treatments, wanting to ease his burden. He should be the one protecting her, not the other way around. "It's a nice thought, Soph, but Mrs. Ortiz could help watch me when you're at physical therapy," Sophie continued, her idea gaining momentum. "We could use the card table from the closet, and I could make signs. I'm good at signs." Mark looked at his daughter's face, thinner now but eyes bright with purpose. Maybe this wasn't about the money at all. Maybe Sophie needed to feel useful, to have something to focus on besides being sick. "You know what?" he said finally. "That sounds like a pretty good idea." Sophie's smile could have lit up the whole building. The next morning was Saturday, another green dot day. Mark woke to the sound of paper rustling. He found Sophie at the kitchen table surrounded by construction paper and markers, her tongue sticking out in concentration. "What do you think?" she asked, holding up a bright yellow sign with wobbly red letters. "Sophie's Sweet Lemonade, Help Fight Cancer." Mark's throat tightened. "It's perfect," he managed. They spent the morning gathering supplies. Mrs. Ortiz from Apartment 3B, who had beaten breast cancer the year before, donated a big plastic pitcher. "Warrior to warrior," she told Sophie with a wink. The building superintendent, Mr. Patterson, gave them a folding chair to go with their card table. Mark bought lemons, sugar, and cups from the dollar store, wincing slightly at even this small expense. "Should we make it fresh or use powder?" Mark asked, studying the lemons. Fresh, Sophie said decisively. The book said quality products get repeat customers. Mark laughed, surprised. Listen to you, business expert. Sophie shrugged, pleased. I pay attention. By noon, they had set up on the corner near their apartment building. It wasn't the fanciest neighborhood in Los Angeles, but it got decent foot traffic, especially on weekends. The card table wobbled slightly on the uneven sidewalk. Sophie had arranged the cups in perfect rows and placed a jar labeled, Tips Welcome, next to her pitcher. How much should we charge? Mark asked, kneeling beside the table to be at eye level with Sophie. She considered, twisting one of the colorful bandanas she now wore to cover her thinning hair. $2, she decided. One for the lemonade, and one to help fight cancer. Mark nodded, his chest swelling with pride at her matter-of-fact courage. Sounds about right. The first hour was slow. A few neighbors stopped by, cooing over Sophie, and dropping extra dollars in the tip jar. Mr. Patterson bought 2 cups and drank neither. For later, he said with a wink. By 2 o'clock, Sophie was wilting in the afternoon sun. Mark was about to suggest they pack up when a woman with a stroller paused in front of their stand. What's this for? She asked, reading Sophie's sign. Sophie stood up straighter. I'm selling lemonade to help pay for my cancer medicine. It's very expensive. The woman's expression softened. She looked from Sophie to Mark, taking in his worn work boots and the fading bruise on his forearm from Sophie's last IV insertion. My sister had leukemia when we were kids, she said quietly. Toughest person I've ever known. Sophie nodded seriously. It's not fun, but the doctors say I'm being very brave. I bet you are, the woman said, fishing in her purse. She pulled out a $20 bill. I'll take 1 cup, please, and keep the change. After that, business picked up. Word seemed to spread through the neighborhood. A postal worker bought a cup, then a group of teenagers from the community college down the street. Each time someone approached, Sophie straightened her bandana and put on her brightest smile, repeating her well-practiced pitch. By 4 o'clock, Mark could see Sophie was exhausted, though she wouldn't admit it. Time to pack up for today, business mogul, he said gently. You did amazing. Sophie looked reluctantly at the half-empty pitcher. But there's still lemonade left. We'll save it for tomorrow. Green Dot Days 2 days in a row, that's pretty special. As they counted their earnings on the kitchen table that evening, Sophie's eyes grew wide. $73.50, Mark announced. Not bad for your first day in business. That's a lot, Sophie said, carefully arranging the bills in neat piles. But not enough yet. Not yet, Mark agreed. But it's a start. That night, after tucking Sophie in, Mark sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. $73 wouldn't make a dent in their medical bills. Even if they did this every weekend for a month, it wouldn't be enough. The reality of their situation pressed down on him like a physical weight. But then he remembered Sophie's face when she handed each customer their cup of lemonade. How she'd stood a little taller, spoken a little louder. For a few hours, she hadn't been a sick kid. She'd been a business owner, a helper, a problem solver. Maybe that was worth more than the money. The next morning, Sophie was up early, ready to go before Mark had finished his coffee. I made a new sign, she announced, proudly displaying her creation. This one had a picture of herself with a big smile and no hair. Mrs. Ortiz says people respond to personal stories. Mark laughed despite himself. Mrs. Ortiz is very wise. They set up in the same spot, Sophie arranging everything just so. The morning started slow again, but Sophie remained undeterred. Each time a potential customer walked past without stopping, she called out cheerfully, "Lemonade for sale! Help fight cancer!" By noon, they had a small line. Sophie's story had spread further through the neighborhood. People came prepared with cash, often waving away their change. A local baker brought cookies to sell alongside the lemonade. The superintendent's wife brought an umbrella to shade Sophie from the sun. As the day wore on, Mark watched his daughter bloom under the attention and purpose. Her cheeks had more color than they'd had in weeks. She wrote down orders, made change, and told abbreviated versions of her story to anyone who asked. not with self-pity, but with the straightforward honesty of a child. "Does it hurt?" a little boy asked, pointing to her bandana. "Sometimes," Sophie answered, "but not as bad as falling off a bike. And I get ice cream after doctor visits." The boy nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and handed over his $2. By the end of the second day, they had made nearly $200. Not enough, not nearly enough, but Sophie was ecstatic. "Can we do it again tomorrow?" she asked as they walked home. Mark carrying the folded table, Sophie clutching her tip jar. Mark hesitated. Tomorrow wasn't a green dot day. It was a blue dot. Hospital day for her treatment. "Not tomorrow, Soph, but maybe next weekend." Sophie's face fell slightly, then brightened again. "That's okay. I can make more signs. And maybe we can try different flavors. The book said product diversity is important." Mark laughed and ruffled her bandana. "Product diversity, huh? Big words from a small businesswoman." Sophie grinned up at him, her eyes shining with pride and purpose. For the first time since the diagnosis, Mark felt a small flutter of hope in his chest. They had a long road ahead, with no guarantee of where it would lead. But for now, his daughter was smiling, planning for next weekend for the future, and that, more than any amount of money, was worth everything. 3 weeks had passed since Sophie's first lemonade stand. The kitchen wall now featured a chart where she tracked her earnings, $643.75 so far. Nowhere near enough, but the number grew each weekend. Today was Tuesday, not usually a lemonade day. But Sophie had been feeling stronger this week, and her blood counts were good enough that Dr. Rivera had suggested a break from treatment, a chance for her body to recover before the next round. "Can we please do the stand today?" Sophie asked over breakfast. "It's not as busy as weekends, but Mrs. Ortiz says you have to be consistent in business." Mark looked out the window at the cloudless sky. It would be hot today. Maybe too hot for Sophie to be outside for long, but she'd been cooped up for days and her eyes were bright with anticipation. "Okay," he agreed, "but only for a couple of hours. And you sit in the shade the whole time." Sophie bounced in her seat, nearly knocking over her juice. "I'll go get the signs." By 10 o'clock, they were set up on their usual corner. Mark had rigged a better shade system using a beach umbrella, borrowed from their neighbor, and some clamps from his toolbox. Sophie wore her newest bandana, a bright blue one with silver stars that matched her eyes. "What's our goal today?" Mark asked as they arranged cups on the card table. Sophie squinted at the sky, thinking. $50, she decided. "It's a weekday, so we have to be realistic with our projections." Mark bit back a smile. Sophie had been watching business shows on TV during her recovery days, absorbing phrases like projected earnings and customer retention that sounded comical coming from her small mouth. The morning crawled by slowly. A few regulars stopped. The mail carrier, who always said Sophie's lemonade was the highlight of his route. An elderly couple from the apartment building who never actually drank the lemonade, but always bought 2 cups. By noon, they'd only made $22. "Not bad," Sophie said optimistically, though Mark could see disappointment in her eyes. The sun climbed higher, baking the sidewalk. Mark checked his watch. They should pack up soon, get Sophie back into the air conditioning. As he was about to suggest it, he noticed a black SUV pull up across the street. "One more customer, maybe," he said, nodding toward the vehicle. Sophie sat up straighter, adjusting her bandana and practicing her smile. The car had tinted windows and shiny rims, not the usual type in their neighborhood. A man stepped out, tall and solidly built. He wore workout clothes, a baseball cap pulled low, and sunglasses that covered much of his face. There was something familiar about him, but Mark couldn't place it. The man looked both ways, then crossed the street toward them. "Hi there," Sophie called out with practiced cheerfulness. "Would you like some lemonade? It's $2, and $1 goes to help fight cancer." The man approached the stand, his walk confident but casual. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than Mark expected, with a distinctive rough edge to it. "Lemonade sounds perfect," he said, pulling out his wallet. "It's hot as blazes out here." As he got closer, Mark felt a jolt of recognition. No way, it couldn't be. But the jawline, the build, the way he carried himself. The man took off his sunglasses, and there was no mistaking him now. Sylvester Stallone, the actor, the legend, was standing at their lemonade stand. Mark froze, but Sophie didn't miss a beat. "It's fresh squeezed," she said proudly, pouring a cup. "I made it this morning." Stallone smiled, the famous crooked grin that had lit up movie screens for decades. Fresh is best. What's your name, kiddo? Sophie Bennett, she replied, handing him the cup. And that's my dad, Mark. Mark managed a nod, still speechless. Sophie had no idea who she was talking to. At 8 years old, she wasn't exactly watching Rocky or Rambo. Nice setup you've got here, Stallone said, taking a sip of the lemonade. He raised his eyebrows, genuinely impressed. That's good. Not too sweet. The secret is a little bit of honey, Sophie confided. And fresh lemons, never the bottled juice. Stallone chuckled. You sound like my mother. She never took shortcuts in the kitchen either. He glanced at Sophie's sign, reading the words carefully. His expression softened as he looked back at Sophie, taking in the bandana covering her head, her thin arms, the determined set of her small jaw. So, you're fighting cancer, huh? Sophie nodded matter-of-factly. Leukemia. It's in my blood. The doctors are giving me medicine, but it costs a lot of money. That's why I'm selling lemonade, Mark. Felt the familiar twist in his stomach, pride at Sophie's courage mixed with the gnawing worry about money that never really went away. I've been doing it for 3 weeks, Sophie continued. I made a chart to track my earnings. Mrs. Ortiz, she had cancer too, says visual representations of progress are motivational. Stallone laughed. A genuine belly laugh that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. She sounds like a smart lady. He turned to Mark, extending his hand. Your daughter's quite the entrepreneur. Mark shook his hand, finally finding his voice. She's something else, he agreed. I'm still catching up to her business sense. Dad helps a lot, Sophie interjected loyally. He built the shade system and carries the heavy stuff. We're a team. Stallone looked between them, something unreadable crossing his face. A team. That's important. He finished his lemonade in one long drink, then placed the cup back on the table. Mind if I ask why you're set up on a Tuesday? Business strategy? Sophie's face lit up at the chance to explain her operations. We usually do weekends when more people are walking around. But I had a break from the hospital today, and Dad could take time off from physical therapy. You have to make hay while the sun shines? Physical therapy? Stallone asked, looking at Mark with interest. Mark shrugged, self-conscious. Construction accident. Back injury. I'm working my way back to full duty. Stallone nodded with understanding. Back injuries are tough. I've had a few myself filming stunts. Are you an actor? Sophie asked, curious now. Stallone smiled. Something like that. Cool, Sophie said politely, though clearly unimpressed. Do you want another cup of lemonade? I can give you a repeat customer discount. This made Stallone laugh again. A discount already? You're cutting into your profits. Customer loyalty is more valuable in the long term, Sophie explained seriously. Can't argue with that logic. Stallone reached for his wallet again, but instead of pulling out a few dollars, he took out a stack of bills. Tell you what, I'm having some friends over later. How about I take 20 cups? Sophie's eyes widened. 20? If you've got enough? Don't want to clean you out. Sophie looked at their pitcher, which was still mostly full. We have enough, but she hesitated, doing quick math. That would be $40 with the regular price. Stallone waved his hand dismissively. Let's make it easier. He pulled out a bill and placed it on the table. Will this cover it? It was a $100 bill. Mark started to protest, but Stallone cut him off. Worth every penny for lemonade this good, and for such a good cause. Sophie stared at the money in awe. That's a lot of lemonade. Tell you what, Stallone said, leaning down so he was eye level with Sophie. You keep the lemonade for other customers. I just need 1 cup for now. Sophie looked at him suspiciously. But you paid for 20. Consider it an investment in your business. While Sophie pondered this, Stallone turned to Mark. I'm filming a movie a few blocks from here. Small independent project, nothing fancy. Trying to stay under the radar. Mark nodded, understanding now why Stallone was in their neighborhood. Not exactly a celebrity hotspot. She doesn't know who I am, does she? Stallone asked quietly, nodding toward Sophie, who was carefully placing the $100 bill in her cash box. Mark shook his head. She's more into animated movies. And lately, business shows. Stallone smiled. Smart kid. Focused on what matters, he turned back to Sophie. So how's treatment going? If you don't mind me asking. Sophie shrugged with the blunt honesty of a child. It's not fun. Sometimes I throw up and I lost my hair. She patted her bandana. But Dr. Rivera says I'm responding well to the protocol. Protocol? Big word. I know lots of big words now. Neutropenia, thrombocytopenia, oncology. Impressive, Stallone said, and he seemed to mean it. A comfortable silence fell. Stallone took another sip of his lemonade, looking thoughtful. You know, when I was starting out, nobody believed in me. I had this crazy idea for a movie about a boxer. Every studio turned me down. Sophie leaned forward, interested despite herself. What did you do? Kept pushing. Wouldn't take no for an answer. Kinda like you with this lemonade stand. Did your movie get made? Stallone nodded. Eventually. It was called Rocky, about a guy who never gives up no matter how many times life knocks him down. Mark watched Sophie's face, saw the moment of recognition. Dad and I watched that. On the hospital TV, the nurses let us stay up late. Stallone's eyebrows rose in surprise. You've seen Rocky? Sophie nodded enthusiastically. Dad says it's good to watch when you're feeling down. Because Rocky keeps fighting even when it's hard. Mark felt his face flush. It was true. He'd put on Rocky one night when Sophie was feeling particularly miserable after treatment. The old movie had been a comfort to him since he was a teenager, and somehow, despite being far from a children's film, it had resonated with Sophie too. Stallone looked at Mark with newfound respect. Good choice. That's exactly what it's about. He turned back to Sophie. So what did you think of it? Honestly, Sophie considered the question seriously. I like the training parts best. And when he runs up those steps at the end, Dad says sometimes you have to find your own steps to run up. Something shifted in Stallone's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight tightening of his famous jaw. Your dad's a wise man, he said quietly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook and pen. Listen, I've got to get back to set, but I'd like to stay in touch. Maybe get updates on your progress. He scribbled something down and handed it to Mark. My personal number. If you need anything at all, call me. Mark stared at the paper in his hand, speechless again. Stallone turned to go, then stopped. Oh, almost forgot. He pulled out his wallet again and placed a second $100 bill on the table. For the road. Thanks for the lemonade, Sophie Bennett. You've got the eye of the tiger, kid. He gave them a wink and walked back to his SUV, leaving Sophie and Mark staring after him in stunned silence. As the car pulled away, Sophie looked up at her father. Dad, was that? Yeah, Mark nodded, still dazed. That was Sylvester Stallone. Sophie's face broke into a wide grin. Cool, and he bought 20 cups of lemonade. Mark laughed, running his hand over his face. Yeah, he sure did. Sophie carefully added the second $100 bill to her cash box. That's $200 today. We smashed our goal. $200, plus a phone number that Mark still held in his hand, hardly believing it was real. He looked at his daughter, her face glowing with triumph, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a lightness in his chest, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things would turn out okay. What do you say we pack up for today? He suggested. Celebrate our best Tuesday ever. Sophie nodded happily. Ice cream? Definitely ice cream. As they folded the card table and packed up their supplies, Mark couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter. Of all the corners in Los Angeles, Sylvester Stallone had walked up to theirs, had talked to Sophie about fighting and not giving up, had left his personal phone number. It felt like something out of a movie. The kind where unexpected miracles happen just when they're needed most. Mark stared at the phone number on the crumpled paper for the third time that evening. Sophie was asleep, worn out from the excitement of the day and the ice cream celebration afterward. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. He picked up his cell phone, then put it down again. What would he even say? Hi, this is the guy with the lemonade stand and the sick daughter. Remember us from this afternoon? It seemed ridiculous. Celebrities gave out their numbers all the time without expecting calls. It was just a nice gesture, something to make them feel good about themselves. And yet something about Stallone's expression when he'd looked at Sophie had seemed genuinely touched. The way he'd connected with her over Rocky, talked to her like a real person rather than a charity case. Mark sighed and tucked the paper into his wallet. Tomorrow was a hospital day, another round of treatments for Sophie. That was what mattered now, not some fantasy about a famous actor swooping in to save them. The hospital was busier than usual the next morning. Dr. Rivera was running late, leaving Mark and Sophie waiting in the treatment room. Sophie was quiet, leafing through a dog-eared magazine someone had left behind. "Look, Dad," she said suddenly, holding up a page. "It's him." Mark leaned over to see a photo of Sylvester Stallone at some red carpet event, looking polished in a dark suit. Nothing like the casual guy who'd bought lemonade from them. "That's so weird," Sophie said, studying the picture. "He looks different in real life." "He's wearing makeup there," Mark explained. "For the cameras." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think he meant it? About wanting updates?" Mark hesitated. "I don't know, Soph. Famous people are busy." "But he gave you his number." "He did," Mark conceded. "So you should text him," Sophie said with 8-year-old logic. "That's why he gave it to you." Before Mark could respond, Dr. Rivera entered, apologizing for the delay. The conversation about Stallone was shelved as they focused on the treatment ahead. Later that evening, after a rough day of chemo that left Sophie dozing fitfully on the couch, Mark found himself alone in the kitchen again, the paper with Stallone's number in front of him. Sophie's words echoed in his head. "That's why he gave it to you." Maybe she was right. What did he have to lose? With a deep breath, he typed a simple message. "This is Mark Bennett from the lemonade stand yesterday. Just wanted to say thank you again for your kindness to Sophie." He hit send before he could change his mind, then set the phone down, telling himself not to expect a response. To his shock, his phone buzzed less than a minute later. "Mark, glad you reached out. How's the little entrepreneur doing?" Mark stared at the screen, hardly believing it was real. He typed back, "Tough day of chemo. She's resting now." 3 dots appeared immediately, showing Stallone was typing. "Sorry to hear that. She's a fighter, though." "I can tell. Listen, I'm filming nearby for the next 2 weeks. Would it be okay if I stopped by the stand again sometime?" Mark read the message twice, making sure he understood correctly. "Of course. We're usually there weekends, weather permitting." Sophie would be thrilled. Another quick response. "Great. How about I bring coffee for you next time? You look like you could use a break." Mark smiled despite himself. "Coffee would be amazing, thanks. No problem. Stay strong, both of you." Mark set the phone down, a strange mix of emotions washing over him. Hope, disbelief, gratitude. From the living room, he heard Sophie stir. "Dad, who were you texting?" Mark walked over to the couch, sitting gently beside her. "Actually, it was Mr. Stallone." Sophie's eyes widened. "Really, what did he say?" "He asked how you were doing, and said he might stop by the lemonade stand again." Sophie smiled weakly, the most energy she could muster after her treatment. "See, I told you to text him." Mark laughed softly, smoothing her bandana. "You're right, as usual." The weekend came, bringing with it unexpected rain that forced them to cancel the lemonade stand. Mark texted Stallone to let him know, feeling oddly comfortable now in this surreal correspondence with a Hollywood legend. "No worries," came the reply. "How's Sophie feeling after treatment?" "Better today. Disappointed about the rain, I get it. Tell her to hang tough. Sun will be back soon." Mark shared the messages with Sophie, who dictated responses for him to send, giggling at the idea of texting with a movie star. It was the most animated Mark had seen her since the treatment. The following Tuesday, Mark's phone buzzed with another text from Stallone. Still on set nearby. "Weather's good today. Lemonade stand happening?" Mark looked out the window at the clear blue sky, then at Sophie, who was having a good day. Her blood counts were up, her energy better than it had been in weeks. "Want to set up the stand today?" he asked her. Sophie jumped up from the couch. "Yes, let me get my supplies." Mark texted back, "We'll be there in an hour. Same corner." This time they weren't surprised when the black SUV pulled up. Stallone emerged wearing the same low-key disguise of baseball cap and sunglasses, but added a fake mustache that made Sophie giggle when she spotted it. "Incognito," he explained, approaching the stand. "Don't want to cause a scene." True to his word, he carried 2 coffee cups, handing one to Mark. "Black, right?" Mark blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" Stallone shrugged. "You strike me as a black coffee guy. No frills." He turned to Sophie. "And how's business today, Miss Bennett?" "Slow," Sophie admitted. "But you're here, so that's 1 customer already." "Make that 2, said a voice behind them. A tall, slender man with a friendly face approached, also wearing sunglasses. Stallone clapped him on the shoulder. "This is my friend Tony," he explained. "He's a writer on the movie we're filming." Tony shook hands with Mark, then bent to greet Sophie. Sly hasn't stopped talking about this legendary lemonade. Had to try it for myself, Sly, Sophie asked, confused. That's what friends call me, Stallone explained, smiling. Like a nickname, Sophie nodded, understanding. My friend Zoe calls me Soph. Exactly like that, Stallone agreed. Tony bought a cup of lemonade, making a show of tasting it critically. Excellent balance, tart but sweet. Professional quality. He pulled out his wallet and placed a $50 bill in Sophie's tip jar, worth every penny. As they chatted, more people began approaching the stand. Mark realized they were crew members from Stallone's film, arriving in twos and threes, each buying lemonade and leaving generous tips. By noon they had a small crowd, and Sophie was beaming with excitement as she poured cup after cup. During a lull, Stallone pulled Mark aside. Hope you don't mind. I mentioned Sophie to some of the crew. They wanted to help. Mark felt a lump in his throat. It's incredibly kind. Thank you. Stallone waved it away. Film crews are like family. We take care of each other. He hesitated. Speaking of which, I hope I'm not overstepping. But I was wondering about Sophie's treatment. Is it working? Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yes and no. She's responding to the chemo, but... He trailed off, not wanting to burden this man, practically a stranger despite his fame, with their problems. But what? Stallone prompted gently. But it's expensive, Mark admitted. Our insurance only covers part of it. The next phase of treatment is even more costly. Stallone nodded, taking this in. How much are we talking? Mark named a figure that still made his stomach clench when he thought about it. The lemonade stand is helping Sophie feel like she's doing something. It gives her purpose. But realistically, it's a drop in the bucket, Stallone finished for him. Exactly. They both looked over at Sophie, who was explaining her business model to an interested crew member. Her small face animated with passion. She reminds me of someone, Stallone said quietly. Who? Me when I was starting out, determined, unwilling to give up. He looked at Mark. And she's got a good coach in her corner. Mark felt his face flush. I'm just trying to keep it together for her. That's what matters. Stallone seemed to make a decision. Listen, I have an idea, but I need to make some calls first. Can we talk later? Before Mark could respond, Sophie called out, Dad! We need more cups. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. By 4 o'clock, when they finally packed up, Sophie's cash box was stuffed with bills. Over $500 in a single day, by far their best ever. This is amazing. Sophie exclaimed as they counted the money at home. We're getting closer to the goal. Mark nodded, helping her update her earnings chart. They were still far short of what they needed, but Sophie's joy was infectious. For this moment, at least, things felt possible. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep, Mark's phone rang. It was Stallone. Sorry for the late call, he said. Just finished shooting. No problem, Mark said, keeping his voice low. Sophie's over the moon about today. Thanks again for bringing your crew. Happy to do it. Listen, I've been thinking about what you told me. About the treatments, Mark felt a twist of embarrassment. I didn't mean to dump our problems on you. You didn't, I asked, Stallone pointed out. And I want to help. That's very generous, but hear me out, Stallone interrupted. I have a foundation that helps families dealing with serious illness. We could make sure Sophie gets the treatment she needs. Mark sat down heavily on the couch, stunned. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Stallone replied simply. Let me help. No strings attached. Mark's throat tightened with emotion. Why would you do this? You barely know us. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Stallone spoke again, his voice was softer. When I was a kid, my family didn't have much. There were times when strangers stepped in and made a difference. I never forgot that. Another pause. And honestly, Sophie reminds me of my own daughter when she was that age. Tough, smart, full of life. Mark wiped at his eyes. I don't know how to thank you. No need. But there is something I'd like to ask. Anything, Mark said immediately. We're filming a scene tomorrow that requires some extras. Nothing big, just background. Would Sophie like to visit the set? If she's feeling up to it. Mark thought of Sophie's face when she realized who had bought her lemonade. How excited she'd been texting with Stallone. She would absolutely love that. Great. I'll send a car for you both around 10. When Mark told Sophie the next morning that they were going to visit a real movie set, she nearly knocked over her cereal bowl in excitement. Really? With real actors and cameras and everything? Yes, really, Mr. Stallone invited us. Sophie raced to her room to find her best bandana for the occasion. Mark watched her go, marveling at the turn their lives had taken. A week ago, they had been drowning in medical bills with no way out. Now somehow a path had appeared. As Sophie returned, proudly wearing a purple bandana with silver stars, she looked up at Mark with bright eyes. Do you think I could be in a movie someday, Dad? Mark smiled, his heart full. I think you can do anything you set your mind to. Soph, anything at all. The morning sun poured through the windows of the children's hospital waiting room, casting long rectangles of light across the colorful carpet. Sophie sat beside her father, swinging her legs and flipping through a magazine. She wore a new bandana today, bright red with tiny white stars, a gift from the costume department on Stallone's movie set. Nervous? Mark asked, noticing her fidgeting. Sophie considered the question. A little, but mostly excited. Today was a big day, Sophie's first checkup since completing her final round of treatment 3 weeks ago. Dr. Rivera would tell them if the cancer was in remission. If Sophie could start thinking about going back to school. If life might finally return to something like normal. So much had changed in the 6 months since Stallone had walked up to their lemonade stand. Sometimes Mark still couldn't believe it. He glanced down at his phone where a good luck text from Stallone himself waited. Thinking of you both today. Sophie's got this. Sophie Bennett? A nurse called from the doorway. Sophie stood smoothing her bandana with practiced fingers. That's me. Mark followed her, amazed as always by his daughter's courage. 8 years old going on 30, people often said, especially now. Dr. Rivera greeted them with a warm smile, her eyes crinkling behind her glasses. There's my favorite entrepreneur. How's business? Good, Sophie replied. We raised over $2,000 at the last event. The events had evolved far beyond their humble lemonade stand. What had started as Sophie's simple idea had grown into something bigger than any of them could have imagined. Dr. Rivera glanced at Sophie's chart. And how are you feeling? Any fatigue? Fever? Pain? Sophie shook her head. I ran a whole mile in the park yesterday. Dad timed me. Impressive, Dr. Rivera nodded. Well, let's have a look at your blood work and see what's happening inside that determined body of yours. As Dr. Rivera examined Sophie, Mark's mind wandered back to the day that had changed everything. The movie set visit had been magical for Sophie. Stallone had given them a personal tour, introducing Sophie to actors, camera operators, and makeup artists. She had watched wide-eyed as scenes were filmed, sitting in a special chair with her name taped to the back. During a break in filming, Stallone had taken them to his trailer to talk privately. That was when he'd told them about his plan. I talked to some friends, he'd said. People who want to help. We've set up an account to cover Sophie's medical expenses. All of them. Mark had been speechless, overwhelmed by the generosity, but Stallone wasn't finished. And there's something else. A few years ago, I started a small foundation for children with serious illnesses. Very low-key, not much publicity. I'd like Sophie to be the face of it. If she's interested, Sophie had looked up from the movie script she was examining. What would I have to do? Just be yourself, Stallone had replied. Tell your story. Show others that it's possible to face tough challenges with courage. Sophie had considered this seriously. Can I still do my lemonade stand? Of course. In fact, that could be part of it. We could organize bigger events, raise more money to help other kids like you. And that was how Sophie's Stand had been born, a foundation that helped families pay for expensive medical treatments their insurance wouldn't cover. The first event had been held right on their street corner, with Stallone bringing along not just his film crew, but several of his celebrity friends. Local news had covered it. Then national news. A video of Sophie explaining her business model to a famous action star had gone viral overnight. Donations had poured in from around the country. Mark's thoughts returned to the present as Dr. Rivera finished her examination. Well, Sophie, she said, her face serious, I've looked at everything very carefully. Sophie reached for Mark's hand, squeezing it tight. And I'm happy to tell you that you are officially in remission. The words hung in the air like magic. Remission. The goal they'd been fighting for through months of treatments, side effects, fear, and hope. Sophie's face broke into a wide grin. Really? Really, Dr. Rivera confirmed. Your blood counts are normal. The cancer cells we were tracking are gone. You still need regular checkups, of course, but for now," she smiled. "You beat it!" Sophie turned to Mark, her eyes shining. "Dad, we did it!" Mark pulled her into a hug, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They had done it. Against all odds, with help that had appeared like something from a movie, they had made it through. Later, as they left the hospital, Sophie practically bouncing with each step, Mark sent a quick text to Stallone. "Great news. Complete remission. She beat it." The response came immediately. "Never doubted her for a second. Tell the champ I'll call tonight to celebrate." Sophie looked up at her father. "Can we go to the lemonade stand corner? Just to see it?" It was a strange request, but Mark understood. "Sure thing." Their corner looked ordinary today. No card table, no colorful signs, no line of customers. Just a sidewalk intersection in a modest Los Angeles neighborhood. But to Mark, it would always be the place where their miracle began. Sophie stood on the spot where her table had been, looking thoughtful. "We should put a sign here, so people remember." "Remember what?" "That big things can start small, like my lemonade stand, and that sometimes help comes from places you don't expect." Mark nodded, once again amazed by his daughter's wisdom. "That's a great idea. Can we call Mr. Stallone and tell him my idea? Maybe the foundation could put a little plaque here. I think he'd love that." As they walked home, Mark reflected on how drastically their lives had changed. The medical bills that had once seemed insurmountable were gone. Sophie was healthy, and somehow, they had become part of something bigger than themselves. A movement that was helping other families facing the same struggles they had. The next evening, a black SUV pulled up outside their apartment building. Stallone emerged carrying a small wrapped package. Sophie had invited him over to celebrate her remission news, and to her delight, he had accepted immediately. Their apartment was modest, nothing like the mansion Stallone surely lived in, but he made himself at home at their kitchen table, accepting a cup of Sophie's lemonade with exaggerated reverence. "The famous recipe," he said, taking a sip. "Still the best in Los Angeles." Sophie beamed with pride. "I've been working on a new flavor too. Strawberry lemonade for the next foundation event." "Innovation. I like it." Stallone set the wrapped package on the table. "This is for you. A little remission gift." Sophie unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small wooden box. Inside was a miniature replica of boxing gloves painted gold, with her name engraved on them. "Just like in Rocky," she breathed, eyes wide. "You fought the toughest fight there is," Stallone said seriously. "You deserve a trophy." Later, after they'd eaten dinner, pizza, Sophie's choice, and discussed plans for the next foundation event, Stallone pulled Mark aside while Sophie showed him her bedroom. "I've been thinking about that movie I'm making," he said. "The one you were filming in the neighborhood?" Stallone nodded. "It's about second chances. A washed-up fighter who finds purpose by mentoring a kid." He hesitated. "I've talked to the writers. We want to change it, base it loosely on Sophie's story." Mark blinked in surprise. "Really? If you're comfortable with it. Names would be different, details changed. But the heart of it, a kid with incredible courage? Fighting against the odds, that's the story I want to tell now." Before Mark could respond, Sophie bounded back into the room. "Mr. Stallone, can you help me with something? I'm making a presentation for school about the foundation. Can I interview you for it?" Stallone laughed. "Right now?" "If you're not too busy," Sophie said seriously. "It won't take long." "Never too busy for my business partner," Stallone replied, allowing himself to be led back to Sophie's room where she had set up a recording studio with her tablet. Mark watched them go, still processing what Stallone had shared. A movie based on Sophie's story, their little lemonade stand inspiring a Hollywood film. It seemed impossible. And yet, after everything that had happened, Mark was starting to believe that nothing was truly impossible. 2 years passed. Sophie's cancer remained in remission. Her hair grew back, curly and thicker than before. She returned to school, started playing soccer, became known for organizing fundraisers for various causes. The gold boxing gloves sat on her bedside table, a daily reminder of the battle she had won. Sophie's Stand Foundation flourished, expanding to help families across the country. The small corner where it had all begun now featured a bronze plaque with Sophie's favorite saying, "Big things start small, and Stallone's movie, titled simply The Stand, premiered to critical acclaim, with Sophie and Mark as guests of honor at the Hollywood opening. The film told the story of a young girl who started a lemonade stand to help with her medical bills, and the unlikely friendship that developed when a famous action star became her customer. On the one-year anniversary of Sophie's remission, they held a special foundation event at the Children's Hospital, where she had received treatment. Tables of lemonade, original and strawberry, lined the courtyard, staffed by children in various stages of treatment, all wearing colorful bandanas designed by Sophie herself. As Mark helped serve cups to the long line of supporters, he caught sight of Sophie across the courtyard. She was kneeling beside a small boy in a wheelchair, his head bald from treatment. She was showing him her golden boxing gloves, which she had brought for the occasion. "The secret is," he heard her tell the boy, "you don't have to win every round. You just have to keep getting back up." The boy nodded solemnly, his eyes wide with hope. Mark felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Stallone beside him. Watching the same scene, "She's something else." "Your daughter," Stallone said quietly. "She is," Mark agreed. "Did I ever tell you why I stopped at your lemonade stand that day?" Mark shook his head. Stallone smiled. "I was having a terrible day. Filming wasn't going well. I was questioning some life choices, feeling sorry for myself." He nodded toward Sophie. "And then I saw this kid, this little fighter with a bandana and a sign about cancer, smiling and working and refusing to give up." He shrugged. "How could I walk past that?" Mark watched as Sophie gave the small boy a high five, making him laugh. "I thought I was helping you two," Stallone continued. "But the truth is, Sophie helped me remember what really matters." Mark nodded, understanding completely. His daughter had that effect on people, reminding them of strength they didn't know they had, inspiring them to be better. As if sensing they were talking about her, Sophie looked up and waved, her smile radiant in the afternoon sun. Mark and Stallone waved back, united by their connection to this extraordinary child who had turned a simple lemonade stand into a movement of hope. Sometimes life's greatest blessings came disguised as its greatest challenges. And sometimes, Mark thought as he watched his healthy, happy daughter, miracles really did happen, one cup of lemonade at a time.